Welcome to the online lecture notes for Connorland, HoWo, and WHAP, dealing with the last great nomadic challenges, and more specifically for the purpose of these lecture notes, the Mongols. So the first thing we've got to do, guys, before we actually get to talking about pastoral societies, and more particularly the Mongols, we need to talk for a second about where in the world we're talking about. In other words, where a lot of these pastoral nomads during this time period are located. And the place that we're talking about is Mongolia, which is here in Central Asia, located to the north of China. So before we get into the Mongols, let's look at these pastoral societies for a second, because it really goes a long way to helping you understand how Mongol society was made up, and how their philosophies and outlooks and how everything kind of determined the way that they ran their civilization, and as we get further on, their empire. So the first thing we're going to look at before we get to them is, why do historians not normally focus on these peoples? And if you think about it, we really haven't talked about pastoral people since the first couple of weeks of class. Well, the reasons for that, and there are several as we go, of why historians don't look at them. Number one, they didn't leave a lot behind. All right? There's no cities like we looked at with Rome, like we looked at in a couple of chapters ago with Chang'an when we were looking at the Tang and Song dynasties. And I'll grant you, I'm going back a little bit with these examples that I'm doing, but that's kind of indicative of any time period and any place that you're looking at. Also, they didn't produce any works of art, and it's particularly a reason because of the way their society worked. No art like we're going to talk about with the Renaissance as we go forward. Also, there was no architecture like the great monuments, like the great things that we've looked at in civilizations like Greece and Rome, and even to a certain extent in Mesoamerica, or in South America, when we look at places like Machu Picchu. And last of all, they didn't leave behind any literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Tale of Genji, and things like that. And the reason they didn't is because they just didn't need them. And you'll figure this out, or you'll see why this is so as we go forward. So as we look at these pastoral societies, you're going to notice some similarities that come up no matter what time period you're talking about and in what place. And the first thing is that these societies normally consist of small populations. And the reason for that is because they have to be mobile. They've got to follow their animals from place to place, from season to season. They also set up shop in mobile encampments because they move from place to place with their animals. Also, their societies are based around kinship clans. And this is more or less the basis of the societies that we'll look at, in particular the Mongols. Because of the fact that they're put together in kinship clans, women have a higher status in these societies than you see in the rest of the world. And this is really because women are essential to survival. In other words, everyone's got to do their share of work to make sure that this society keeps going. And last but not least, mobility, which I've already talked about. So once again, before we get to the Mongols, let's look at nomadic states in general, just to get an idea of kind of how these things work and how they kind of set the precedent, or how they relate to how the Mongols ran their civilization when they get going. Now, when you look at nomadic states, there are some disadvantages and advantages to how these societies run and how they work. First of all, with the main disadvantage, they really don't have any wealth, and that comes from a lack of trade, or a lack of long-distance trade. Now, they do things like trade with local peoples when they're in a certain place to get some of the basic necessities of life that they can't produce themselves. But as far as going about it in the ways that other people that we've looked at this year do it, they just don't. They were able to get wealth in some ways, and it was mainly by raiding different parts, depending on where they were at the time of the year. Going back to the disadvantages, there's internal rivalries, and a lot of it's simply because they're based in kinship units. So when there's some kind of conflict, when there's some kind of feud, it's more personal and it's more exposed because it's between families rather than different independent societies. Going back to the advantages, I know I'm skipping around here, but because their lives are based around the horse, because they do a majority of their things with a horse, they have a military advantage when they go into battle with people, because they're already used to some of the maneuvers and some of the tactics when it comes to warfare and fighting in a cavalry style. When looking at the nomadic world as a whole, these societies are entirely dependent on their herds, on the animals that they have around them, and in particular the horse. They rely on these things for just about most of their basic needs, like meat, like milk, like clothes, boots, and tents, and they're completely reliant on these things as a way of keeping their society going. Another factor of nomadic states is that children are brought up with horses, okay? So from the time they're born, they learn how to ride, probably in most cases before or shortly after they begin to learn to walk. When they do this, there's a level of comfort that comes about between the horse and the rider that translates very well to warfare as we go forward. I mean, it gets to the point where you can eat and you can even sleep on your horse because you trust this animal with your life, and it's been trained to do the things that it needs to do to bring you victory or to travel or whatever it is. So we move forward from an overview of nomadic states and pastoral societies to the main event of these notes, and it's the Mongols. And we're going to start out with the guy who gets all this started, and it's Chinggis or Genghis Khan. As you can see, like a lot of things that we've talked about this year, you can see the name spelled in a couple of different ways, and you can also hear it pronounced in different ways. So you might hear me go back and forth as we go from Genghis to Chinggis, but just know that it applies to the same person. So here's the deal with Genghis, and we're going to start out with a little bit of background on just his upbringing, and I'm going to elaborate on this more fully in class, but just the basics of it. He was born with the name Temujin, and when he was born holding a blood clot, which was seen as a sign of good luck or a sign that he was going to be a powerful leader in Mongol legend, in Mongol lore. As far as his upbringing when he was a child, it was very chaotic. Like I said, I'm not going into the details here, but when he was a young child, his father was killed, and his family was ostracized, or was basically kicked out of the tribe that they were in. So for that reason, his family became a group of scavengers, and it was a very harsh, very rough existence for him trying to survive. I've got murder with a question mark because it's kind of a disputed story, but it's said, according to legend, or according to the story of Genghis, that he found out that his older brother was stealing food from his family when they were trying to survive during this harsh time. And Genghis confronts him about it, and they get into an argument, and Genghis kills his brother, and effectively making him the head of their little family unit, tribal unit, whatever you want to call it. As far as kidnapping of the wife, we'll go into that with class, but you need to know that all these events shaped the way that the man that he grew into, and the leader that he became, and we'll look at some of those factors of his leadership as we go forward. So after he gets through this chaotic upbringing, Genghis eventually begins to unite the different tribes of nomads that are in Central Asia, that are in what is now known as Mongolia. And as he does this, it's because of a couple of factors. He becomes what is known as a master of steppe diplomacy, and steppe refers to the geographic formation, the landform that Mongolia is in. He displayed several traits that were very valued in this society. And number one, and first of all, was personal courage in battle. He didn't quit, he didn't give up, he never retreated, or he rarely retreated, and he always fought at the front of his men. He also instilled intense loyalty to the people that followed him, and he in return gave that loyalty back. He was very loyal to people that were under him. And also he had a charismatic way about him, a very persuasive way that gave him an ability to get other tribes to cooperate and to come in to his tribe, or to his nation as he comes to call it, as he rises to power. So now we move to the thing that probably the most interesting part from your perspective, and it's the Mongol war machine. It's how they fought their battles, how they went about with their tactics, and how they started to create this empire that becomes one of the largest in world history as it goes. So as far as the Mongol army goes, the first thing you need to realize is just how tough and how good of warriors these people were. And it's mainly because of their upbringing, from the fact that they were pastoral nomads that came from this society. And it's mainly because of the skills that they learned at a very young age. And like I said earlier, these skills kind of leading into success in military, because they're very applicable to fighting in a battle. The first thing, once again, they came up on a horse. All right, they learned how to ride at an early age, and they were expert horsemen in this time period. Also, from having to hunt to get their own food. You can translate that. When you get used to shooting a bow at a deer, it's very easy to translate that skill to shooting soldiers that you're fighting in a battle. Also, and probably most importantly, these guys were tough and they were mobile. And once again, it comes from the upbringing that they had, and the fact that you had to be tough and mobile to be able to thrive, to be able to survive in this society. As far as their weapons go, the main ones were lances, hatchets, and the short bow, which comes to be known as the Mongol bow. And it was one of the most feared weapons in the world during this time period, because you could shoot this thing riding on a horse over 400 yards. So you could shoot this thing over 4 football fields and hit something and be relatively accurate with it. As far as how the leadership aspects of the Mongol army worked, they were known for several things, and it's really what contributed to them being so successful. They were very organized and disciplined. I can't speak highly enough of how important that is to be successful as an army. Okay, they were also very united, because they were pushing towards a common cause. They both were willing to die for Genghis and all this kind of stuff. As far as the organization and the way that the army broke down, they were divided into tumens, and they went all the way from 10 soldiers with somebody in charge, all the way up to 10,000 soldiers with somebody in charge. So you had different levels of hierarchy and smaller units as you go down, that made it a little bit easier to communicate and keep everyone pushing towards the common goal. Now, it goes without saying when we talk about the discipline and the unity of the Mongol army, it did not hurt that if you disappointed the Khan, if you fled from battle, if you didn't push forward, if you ran away, the penalty for this was death. And the reason for that was because they had to go forward. They had to keep pushing. And you had to, I guess, bad to say, but you had to motivate people to keep fighting. And the best way to do that was to set the example that if you fled, you would die. So it kept these soldiers pushing and kept them motivated to constantly win. A, because they didn't want to die, and B, because they didn't want to disappoint the Khan. One of the key things about the Mongol army that we haven't seen a whole lot, and it speaks a lot to the leadership of Genghis Khan and the fact that he didn't have, his ego wasn't so large that he wasn't scared to adapt to things that might work. And the way that it went was as he encountered new obstacles, as he encountered people who resisted him or pushed against him, if that opposing army had some success against him, he would then adopt their tactics and use them to go into the next battle. Some of the things that he picked up along the way that they did not have when they started the Mongol Empire were things like flaming arrows and gunpowder and siege machinery. And the reason they picked those up is simply because they worked against the Mongols. So he wasn't too good to think that he didn't need to get help or to improve from watching other armies or from confronting other armies. So he took the best from the people he conquered and then used it as they pushed forward. Now, while we're in the midst of talking about the army, we might as well talk about the conquest. And from this map, you can see the extent of the Mongol Empire at its height of power. This is actually going to happen after Genghis dies. He doesn't conquer all these territories, but his sons and grandsons kind of kept going in the spirit that he set. In the fact that Genghis Khan felt his destiny was to rule the known world, and he did everything in his power to make sure that happened. And then as time goes on, they keep trying to expand to make this happen. In other words, to fulfill his destiny or his vision. Now, as the Mongols enter this era of conquest and as they start expanding, specifically at first, the biggest obstacle that they face is fortified cities. In other words, cities that have walls around them. And the reason they had so much problem with it is simply because the Mongols did not have walls, all right? So they had never built them. They had never had to maintain them. They had never had to defend any armies trying to get through there. So for that reason, it was a completely alien concept with them. So in response to that, or as a way to try to get into these cities, they began to develop siege weapons such as rams, catapults, and bamboo rockets. Now, some of these things came from people they had already conquered. Some of it came from people who had come into the Mongol fold. And some of it was just straight up improvised as they went. To try to figure out how to get into them. And as time goes on, they begin to find more and more ways to get into these things, and it becomes less of an obstacle. It's a really big thing that holds them up when this conquest begins. Genghis was the king of psychological warfare, and this is one of the earliest examples of using it on a widespread basis, and he did this by several ways. First of all was just pure terror. All right? The fact that he built up an image of the Mongols as being this ruthless, hardcore kind of group that would come in and completely obliterate your life. And as time goes on and as they keep conquering more and more places, people ahead of that were soon to be conquered would get more and more scared as they got closer. A way that he went about and did this, one, was by completely annihilating cities and areas and places like that. And he also was good at rumors, at word of mouth, at kind of accentuating his numbers, making it seem like they had more people in their army than they did. And for that reason, before they even got to places, in most cases, the people were already psyched out and were willing to negotiate or to surrender rather than fight. So as they keep moving forward, they notice that it gets a little bit easier and easier to conquer places for a little while until they get to China, which we'll talk about here in a second. Also, he was the king of biological weapons at this time. The Mongols were pretty good at firing severed heads and animals from their catapults into cities. Now, there were two reasons for this. Number one was to scare the crap out of people. All right, there's nothing more terrifying than a severed human head or an entire horse getting thrown into your town. Also, the second reason was when these dead animals were thrown into the town, it spread disease. So it was a way to fight the city without actually being in the city. So that was a brief overview of the Mongol war machine. We'll obviously look at it a little bit more in-depthly in class, but we're going to transition now to life under the Mongols, or what it was like to rule under them once they conquered your area, city, civilization, whatever it is. One of the biggest characteristics of the Mongols was once they conquered a place, they were generally relatively tolerant of the people who were already there. In other words, they had already conquered it, so they didn't really care. As long as you held the peace, as long as you didn't start anything against them or anything like that, they were going to be pretty cool with you. And it mainly boiled down to their religions and their customs. Like, there were Buddhist people, Confucianists as we go, Christians to a certain extent, and other religious groups that just weren't really harassed by the Mongols at all when they came in and took these places over. They also decided at a point on down the line that they needed their own city. They needed their own showcase for their dynasty, much like China had. So they built a city called Karakorum. And when they did, because they didn't really have all the skills that were necessary to build a city because they didn't have it in their civilization, they knew that they needed some experts to come in and help them out. And they brought in people from China, they brought in people from the Middle East, they brought in people from other places around Asia and from the Middle East to help them build this city and help them run it. For example, the Confucians came in and gave them ideas on government and how to run a city, and that comes from the experience they had in China. Muslims were some of the biggest engineers and some of the biggest experts in trade at this time, and it stems back from that golden age of Islam that we talked about a couple of chapters ago. So they came in and helped them with that. And then they brought in some Taoist people to kind of give them a sense of immortality, to bring those philosophies and those customs from Taoism into it as well. As a result of this toleration, a couple of things come about. First of all, in Central Asia, or actually in Asia as a whole, you see an era of peace that has not been seen in who knows how many years. It's not going to be seen for several hundred years after. So because of that, trade routes, particularly the Silk Road, become way more secure. In other words, this is the first time in a long time that you can travel from China to the Middle East along the Silk Road and not worry about being robbed, not worry about being killed. And it's simply because of the Mongol presence along these different spots on the Silk Road. So you could, trade picks up, culture continues to move, diffusion happens, and all these things start to happen simply because of the Mongol influence. Now we're going to move forward to some of the westward conquest, and we're kind of going to break this conquest section into two parts. We're going to look at the westward direction of it first, and then we're going to focus on the eastward, which particularly consists of China. So as we look at this westward conquest, remember that a lot of this happens after Genghis passes away, and a lot of the western conquest happens under the leadership of Ogadai, who was Genghis's grandson. As they begin to move westward, as word of mouth, once again with the spreading of that terror, as this happens, Ogadai's army comes to be known as the Golden Horde, which translates to the people from hell. And it gives you an idea of kind of the mindset of people who were in the path of these Mongol conquest, and the fear and the terror that they instilled because of the way that they defeated people, and along with that, how completely they defeated people. First place we're going to look at is Russia, and there's a couple of goals as the Mongol army begins to move into Russia, and they're not really different than a lot of conquering armies that we've looked at up to this point, and we'll look at going forward. Number one, they had to fine-tune their war machine. In other words, you can't have an army sit around for an extended period of time. For lack of a better term, they've got to practice, and this was as good a place as any to start spreading them along and having them practice. They also had to finance the army and the empire. Once they built the city of Karakorum, they realized that it was very expensive to keep this thing running, to manage the upkeep of the city. So they needed to do that as well as support the army. So they were looking for money from booty. In other words, from pillaging, from conquest. So as this army moves into Russia, it's a little bit different than a lot of places that we've looked at, and I think it's simply because of the difficulties that they faced along the way, and the fact that I believe the Mongols were trying to send a message when they went into Russia. The result of these conquests, and we're not going into the particulars, were thousands of peasants get slaughtered or sold into slavery. So they kind of take out that lower class of Russian society. And what ends up happening at the end of the day is 250 years of Mongol rule. Now the effects of this eventually lead to the rise of the actual Russian state that we'll handle in a few chapters from now. The effects, once again, looking at it, the peasants begin to flee, trade increases as always happened when the Mongols came in, and it leads to, from the people who left or who fled from the Mongol army, you see the rise of Moscow, which eventually, after 250 years of rule, I'll grant you it's not a short process, but it leads to an overthrow of the Mongols as they weaken, and in the establishment of the Russian state, once again, that we'll look at as going forward. Next place we'll look at is the assault on Islam. Once again, particular is dealt with in class. It's just a general overview, but you need to know that the Mongol army moves in 1258 and Baghdad falls. In the midst of this battle, over 800,000 people were killed, which makes it one of the largest conquests in Mongol history. The effects of it, once again, it ends the 400-year-old Abbasid dynasty that had asserted itself and controlled more or less Islam for the better part of half a millennium. It also leaves Muslims without a central authority, and as we go forward in other chapters, we'll talk about how this led to the development of what were called the gunpowder empires. And then also it hurt trade, which makes it a little bit different than it did in other places, but it hurt trade in the Middle East and in Islamic lands. Moving from westward conquest to the east, and once again we're talking about the Chinese. Now we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about the development of the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty is founded by Kublai Khan, who was another one of Genghis's grandsons. And as he comes in, he tries to get into China a couple times before he finally does. And once he actually gets in there and establishes a Mongol presence, he creates a new dynasty, which is called the Yuan. Some of the characteristics of this dynasty, not as much toleration with Kublai in China as it was in other places, but one of the first things he does is he separates Mongols and Chinese because he didn't want Chinese culture to infiltrate his Mongolian heritage and his Mongolian people. Some of the things that he put into effect: number one, Mongols, when they came into the Yuan dynasty, were forbidden from marrying Chinese women. He also kept Mongol religious ceremonies to try to keep some sense of the culture that they had before they got there. He also installed yurts in capitals, and he abolished the civil service exam, which we looked at a couple of chapters before. In regards to gender roles, the first thing Kublai did is he abolished foot binding. Now, it does see a resurgence as we go forward and actually last up until the early 19th century, but during this period of the Yuan dynasty, there's no foot binding for women in China. He also, and I find this kind of random, but he tried to take the daintiness out of women and convert them over to more of a Mongolian way of life. He made them do things like ride horses and wrestle in a way to just generally tough them up and make them more like the women who had been a part of his life during his upbringing and during his conquest. And to kind of While Kublai tried to keep the Mongols and the Chinese separate during this time, there was a certain semblance of tolerance that did happen during the Yuan dynasty. First of all, it comes from the cosmopolitan atmosphere of China at this time anyway. There were a lot of scholars and artists and artisans. There was also a rise of a Muslim social class. And this was particularly because he took this from his grandfather, Genghis, and the fact that he brought people in to try to make his culture, to make his civilization better. And these Muslim artisans came in and were experts in building and astronomy and medicine to try to kind of up the learning, I guess you could call it, of the Yuan dynasty. And he also welcomed visitors from Europe, particularly the most famous Marco Polo, who WHAP will look at a little bit going forward, or have a little bit, but concentrate more on him later. And HoWo will look at him going forward and some of his views on the Yuan dynasty and some of the relations that he had with Kublai Khan. Like every civilization we've talked about and every civilization we will talk about going forward, eventually the Yuan dynasty begins to decline and eventually falls. And the reason this happens is for several reasons. Number one is the loss of invincibility that happens over time. And this is not an uncommon characteristic. You see this in a lot of places. But over time, as the Mongols become more and more ingrained in society, as there becomes more and more interaction between Mongols and the Chinese, the Mongols lose their invincibility. In other words, they lose that aura, because when they came in, they were seen as larger than life. They were seen as being untouchable. But as they become more and more familiar with each other, they come to know the Mongols more as people and not so much as overriding presences. There was also a softening of the ruling class, which ties back to luxury. Once you start being prosperous, once you start getting a taste of luxury items, you kind of lose the edge and the hunger and the drive that made you go in and conquer this place in the first place. And that's what happens here. Also, you start to see revolt. You start to see the beginnings of some kind of revolution. There's revolts, there's banditry, there's piracy, there's an undermining of the Mongol authority that begins to happen over time that leads, going back to the first point, to the loss of invincibility. And last but not least, you start to see some climatic conditions come in the form of famine, which leads to hardships on peasants. And if you kind of pay attention to this, you can see some of the components of the mandate of heaven come into play here. So they kind of lose like the authority to rule, I guess you could say. The last thing we're going to look at is the impact of the Mongols, and WHAP, this is pretty important because your next essay is going to be on the impact of the Mongols, so it'd be a good idea to really pay attention to this part. The first and most obvious impact of the Mongol presence and their conquest is death. All right, we're talking battles on a huge scale back then. We're talking deaths in the hundreds of thousands to the millions as a total. In other words, we're talking mass casualties wherever they went. Well, what this leads to is a decreased will of the enemy. As time goes forward, the conquests become, I think I said this earlier, a little bit easier than they were at the first because people kind of have a good idea of how it's going to go, so their will is broken before the Mongols even get there. And what that leads to is a reduction in the future resistance that they face going forward. One of the things we're going to look at going forward, and it kind of stems back to these mass casualties I was talking about in the last slide, but we're going to examine how barbaric and how ruthless the Mongols were, because I think history has given them a little bit too much credit as being ruthless. Now, I'll grant you, they killed millions of people, but at the same time, they were more than willing to spare people who would be of some use to them. In other words, somebody who would contribute or strengthen the empire. So if you were an artisan, if you were a scribe, if you were a scholar, you were less likely to be killed if you made it known that you would be able to help them out. Part of the reason for this is because the Mongols were products of their time. All right, the way that warfare worked and the way civilization worked was you wiped out people that you were trying to conquer. But they, on the flip side, they were a little bit different in that they were willing to spare people, and that's something we'll look at a little bit more in depthly in class. Next impact we're going to look at is the destruction of the places that the Mongols went as they began to conquer and as they conquered. They're a little bit different than other places we'll look at this year because it wasn't a matter of policy from the top. They didn't deliberately go out and try to destroy these places. It was more a byproduct of just the process of conquering. So I guess you could say it wasn't necessarily intentional. It was just more a part of the process. One of the key things that they did, though, is if a city was destroyed or something was torn down, burned, whatever it was, they normally built it back because it was in their best interest. These places would become part of the Mongol Empire, so it helped the empire out if they were thriving, if they were a part of trading posts, if they were prosperous, because one of the ways that the Mongol Empire kept going was that these cities would pay tribute to the Mongols as a condition of their surrender. And then next on the list, we've got disease. We've already talked about this in class. For you guys in HoWo, we'll talk about it later. But the Black Death more or less can be traced to the conquest of the Mongols and the trade that opened up because of them, and the routes that kept thriving because of it. The Black Death, as we talked about, originated in Mongol lands, originally spread to Europe, and wiped out a significant portion of the population. And last but not least is the voluntary or involuntary displacement or migrations of people. Now, a lot of this happens from fleeing from the army when they get advance word that they're coming. Some of it has to do with occupying forces or Mongols who were left behind as the army moved on in an effort to control the cities, and also the craftsmen and the artisans and the people that were taken with the army. So you see these huge numbers of populations move along with the Mongol conquest, and then these people stay over a period of time, and their culture and everything kind of lends to the development of these places and the cultures that you see today. Alright, so that wraps up the Nomadic Challenges, or the Mongols online lecture. We'll talk about all these things more in depthly in class. We'll see you next time for HoWo when we're talking about the Middle Ages, and WHAP when we move into exploration.